Well, all right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our last, but not least, lecture from Blasis from this semester. I'm Alberto Vargas. I'm the associate director, and I'm very happy to introduce our speaker today, Professor Falina Enriquez from the Anthropology department. Yeah. So with that, I'll pass the floor to Falina.
So this is my third lecture of the morning. So apologies if I'm not too ecstatic here. So this is a talk that kind of encapsulates what my book is about. It provides some overview. It's just like a slice. So hopefully it will entice you to read the book, either to purchase it or check it out from library. So Recife, the capital of Pernambuco, has long been known as a musical place. During the 21st century, local institutions and individuals strengthened Recife's musical reputation by highlighting its traditional roots, while nonetheless depicting the city as modern and cosmopolitan. The city's carnival epitomizes these transformations. Since the early 2000s, Recife's municipal government has marketed it as a multicultural event to boost the economy and to foster an inclusive sense of belonging among citizens. This sponsored festival begins with an abertura, or opening ceremony, on the Friday before Ash Wednesday in Recife Antigo, or Recife, the island where the city was founded in 1537. Recife has since grown into a metro area with over 4 million residents. It's a major commercial, political, and cultural hub. But Recife also has the highest rates of social inequality in Brazil compared to similar cities, even in the Northeast, a region long shaped by social stratification due to slavery and its legacy. In March 2011, however, inequality seemed a remote concern for the hundreds of families, teenagers, and groups of middle-aged friends gathered in Recife evening. After a group of trumpeters played an opening fanfare, the MC described the multicultural carnival as a quote-unquote marvelous mixture. The succession of musical groups that followed revealed 3 intertwining qualities are key to making Recipe's carnival multicultural: musical variety, tradition, and inclusivity. 2011's Abertura included a broader assortment of music than before, including groups performing capoeiras, an indigenous musical genre with its trotting rhythm. Later, an orchestra played frevo, the fast syncopated brass genre that's arguably Recife's most famous carnival music. The apex of the Abertura was the gathering of hundreds of maracatu musicians, which a local newspaper described as, quote, the most important Afro-Brazilian display in Pernambuco, quote. The ensemble played maracatu's distinctive, syncopated, turned-around beat, while members of each group's royal courts paraded on stage. The Abertura was one of many performances held across the metro area. These included bands that performed hardcore punk, politically conscious hip-hop, and mainstream middle-class pop known as MPB or Brazilian popular music. Carnival also features bands that fuse transnational genres like rock with local traditional music and national genres like samba, producing a mix that isn't typically heard in national mainstream media. Most of these bands rely on state sponsorship to varying extents. They constitute the city's countercultural alternative scene, or Cena Alternativa. The multicultural carnival's musical diversity fosters a sense of identity and belonging. In my research from 2009 to 2018, I interacted with people in various music-related professions, as well as university students, white-collar professionals, and members of the working class. I noticed they often compared Recife's carnival with official carnival celebrations in cities like Rio de Janeiro and Salvador Bahia. For them, these other celebrations are not multicultural and thus not as authentic as Recife's, because they evidently emphasize one genre and charge admission, even though carnival is supposed to be for the masses, not the elite. Recife's carnival, however, is purportedly more inclusive. It's free and takes place on the street. My interlocutors also defined the multicultural carnival in relation to quote-unquote many rhythms, each of which are commonly associated with specific social groups. In the US, we tend to understand multiculturalism as a discourse that includes immigrants and their descendants in national narrative. Official and vernacular understandings of multiculturalism in Pernambuco, however, have little to do with immigration. Recife attracts international migrants, but these groups are relatively small and don't have strong musical presences in the city. Instead, Carnival is heard as multicultural because it includes a variety of musical rhythms or genres, each of which are generally understood as indexes of and even proxies for specific groups. For example, Caboclinhos indexes indigenous people, Maracatu indexes Afro-Brazilian people, and Frevo, as well as contemporary pop music, index the state's interracial urban population. Carnival's musical diversity suggests that Recife is a cosmopolitan city rooted in, but not limited by, local tradition. Despite Carnival's musical capaciousness, however, its official programming excludes commercially popular dance genres typically associated with working class musicians and audiences, including pagode from the state of Bahia, a variant of samba, and the dance genre brega. Bureaucrats and middle-class music professionals disqualify these contemporary genres from inclusion in Carnival because they apparently lack quote-unquote cultural representativeness. Some of these actors even jokingly describe such genres as quote musical venereal diseases. Unquote. These discourses implicitly and sometimes explicitly resonate with the long-standing racialization and pathologization of working class Northeast. The fact that the multicultural carnival doesn't fully incorporate the variety of music and demographic groups present in Pernambuco reveals that musical sponsorship isn't just about inclusivity. Instead, it's also about restricting resources and controlling citizens' socioeconomic and aesthetic practices. Government sponsors want musicians to promote Pernambuco as a prestigious, distinctive, and economically vibrant place where tradition and modernity, as well as the local and global, exist in harmony. Sponsorship standards accordingly require musicians to be more professional and entrepreneurial. I examined how musicians negotiate these demands, which stem from the ongoing global intensification of neoliberalism, a core economic policy, and the normative social influence of white capitalism. Under these conditions, the role of state sponsorship and the state itself is to uphold and expand market logics that compel people to transform themselves into enterprises. This is a requisite of the globally ascendant new economy or gig economy, which consists of precarious project-based work within the service and cultural industries. Musicians, of course, have long commodified their music, but the current gig economy pushes them to create market value in and through every corner of their lives. Political theorist Wendy Brown calls this the economization of everything. Accordingly, musicians in Recife and elsewhere don't just sell music, they must also sell themselves as professionals with marketable skills and sociocultural capital. Sponsorship doesn't protect musicians from these demands. Most of them can't make a living from sponsorship alone. And in fact, fully subsidizing musicians and cultural producers isn't the goal. Rather, in keeping with gig economy principles, bureaucratic programs are supposed to jumpstart musicians' incomes so that they, as opposed to government institutions, can take on the risks of strengthening Pernambuco's relatively weak private musical markets. These conditions transform citizens and the state into commercial partners. I compare musicians in Recife to illustrate that the process of economizing everything continues transforming citizens into neoliberal subjects, even when policies appear to direct neoliberalism toward benevolent aims like multiculturalism. During the 2000s, Pernambucan and federal cultural policies prioritized multiculturalism along with democratic participation and social assistance programs. These policies were curtailed in part by the economic recession of the 2010s, Dilma Rousseff's impeachment, and the rise of Bolsonarism. Tracing how my interlocutors have adapted their professional and aesthetic practices in relation to institutional standards reveals that although there are meaningful differences between leftist approaches from the 2000s and the right-wing regimes that followed, both eras were characterized by state efforts to economize culture and transform citizens into entrepreneurs. Multicultural policies already included efforts to incentivize entrepreneurship among cultural producers. But by the early 2000s, due in part to the country's economic decline, cultivating entrepreneurs became an even stronger focus of governance at multiple levels. The multicultural carnival is thus a response to and outcome of neoliberalism. It's part of efforts to incentivize entrepreneurship, brand Pernambuco as a tourist destination, and integrate the state into global markets. It also shows insiders and outsiders that Pernambuco is different from, and therefore not subordinate to, national forms of cultural hegemony. The multicultural carnival relies on individuals and groups who co-produce what I call rooted cosmopolitanisms. Generally, cosmopolitanism is a form of world citizenship that counters nationalism by enabling literal and figurative movements across culture. The musical cosmopolitanisms I heard in Recife juxtapose different stylistic elements and blur categories like local and global, tradition and modernity to project the city into broader imaginings. Yet in articulating their cosmopolitan sounds and practices, events at Carnival and the musicians I know also constructed a rooted sense of the local. Rooted cosmopolitanism stylistically describes music dynamic, but it's also a framework to compare how musicians contribute and respond to the cultural politics of the gig economy. My interlocutors draw from their federal roots in different ways and for different reasons, but they share an openness to connect communities with music, people, and ideas from distant places and times, expanding their affiliations beyond the city. This case study thus contributes to understanding cosmopolitan expressions while foregrounding how power fundamentally affects them. The musical practices I discussed are construed in relation to material and ideological circumstances that enable, yet paradoxically limit, people's cosmopolitan practices in unequal ways. Let's see how one band understands the rooted cosmopolitan sound and stance. A Roda was an alternative scene band that occupied a niche known as Original Olinda Style, or in English, Original Olinda Style, even though that already is English. Named after the historic city of Olinda, located in the Recife metro area, Original Olinda Style emerged in the early 2000s. A Roda and bands like Orquesta Contemporânea de Olinda have intertwined aspects of traditional genres like maracatu with others like rock and reggae. Together, these mostly middle-class bands have created a distinct aesthetic and community that fosters a sense of rootedness to the area. Being rooted means understanding both of heritage while remixing it through contemporary cosmopolitan frameworks. Accordingly, Ahoba's activities create a sense of belonging to the sphere that keeps them socio-aesthetically rooted to the Recife area while nonetheless extending outward beyond it. So I'll play you a clip just to give you a sense of what they sound like very briefly, but some people have not playing anything else. If you're interested there, that album is on YouTube. It's not, I don't think it's on Spotify or any of those services. It's called Chavadio and it's from their second album called Live to See That, which is concerned. Good time. In 2010, after 7 years together, Ahoda had achieved some success. However, the band's 9 male members weren't relying on Ahoda as a main source of income. Instead, they earned a living performing in other bands, doing other music-related work like teaching, or working in fields of graphic design. They were hopeful that Ahoda could become more lucrative, but their aspirations were hindered by limited finances and incompatible schedules. Ahoda was thus a pet project, guided by friendship as the quote-unquote main principle. Guga, the percussionist, said they wanted to make good music, quote, regardless of whether it will sell, end quote. Despite a lack of commercial ambition, Ahoda benefited in direct and indirect ways from multicultural policies. They tended to perform privately financed shows at small venues, but the band pursued and received sponsorship from the state government to produce their second album, which you just heard a track from. This solidified their legitimacy, including among local bureaucrats. Ahoba's description of their motivations as a group aligned the power dynamics that shaped their participation in the band. The fact that playing music they liked earned them some prestige didn't exclusively emerge from their talent. Rather, it also rests on and reinforces their privileged position within a stratified social order. Many people in the city form bands among friends, but not everyone can acquire state funding to finance these projects. Ahoba's social position must help them create a version of music cosmopolitanism that reflects their collective musical interests but also aligns to institutional standards. The band's power to balance their goals and tastes with institutional standards is evident in how they presented themselves. Publicly and in grant applications, they marketed themselves as quote-unquote genuinely Pernambuco. State sponsorship reinforced this sense of authenticity. At times, their performances at sponsored events secured them press coverage and landed them on institutional websites that promote local culture. But in conversations with me, AHALA's members also understood their mostly instrumental composition as quote-unquote universal because of their fusion of local and global styles. For AHALA, this universality is linked to global northern imaginary. When I asked band members to identify who they most sounded like, they didn't identify any local bands nor the other contemporary Brazilian artists who were also mixing Brazilian genres with Afrobeat. Instead, they compared themselves to bands from Brooklyn, New York. For example, Andre identified the Manhattan Street Band as AHALA's closest analog. Martinez agreed that the band is just like AHALA, quote, except with trumpet and both instead of saxophone. The Manhattan Street Band is part of the self-described 80s label Afro Records. Bands in this labeled lineup combine genres associated with the African diaspora, including soul and Afrobeat. Like their imagined peers in Brooklyn, AHALA's access to these genres constructed by what Simon Frick calls a quote universal pop aesthetic. This is a transnational sensibility fostered by globalization and the proliferation of world music addressed to the global northern consumer. Shared access to this universal aesthetic facilitated AHALA's ability to hear themselves as quote unquote the same as Brooklyn-based bands and feel an affinity towards them as peers, despite never having seen them in person. Like other global Southerners, AHALA's cosmopolitanism didn't exclusively depend on travel. In fact, when I met them, most of the band members hadn't traveled much at all. Accordingly, AHALA's cosmopolitanism lacks an elitist detachment from the local. Instead, the local is a foundation from which they create new sound and perspective. Huga generally labeled AHALA as world music, but only because their sound is apparently difficult to convey to a layperson. Instead, you could refer the term deconstructivist as completista, because as the band blend rhythms from all over the world, they also change them. Huga explained that although they might play a Cuban son montuno rhythm, they'll vary the song's rhythmic cell and include instruments associated with traditional Pernambucan genres. Martinez echoed Huga's description, commenting that they add their own quote-unquote personality to domestic and international rhythms and genres. In describing their sound, AHALA's members socially position themselves. Deconstructivist is a postmodern academic term that rarely surfaces in everyday conversations with Recife. In using it, Huga does what linguistic anthropologist Michael Silverstein called evaluating by describing, or performatively depicting himself and the band as sophisticated artists whose sound lies beyond the full comprehension of non-professionals. This sound reflects but also transcends the local in ways that enhance their aspiration to create universal music. These and similar discourses I heard from alternative scene participants include classifications that correspond to social distinctions within Brazil and relative to the global economy. Since the 1960s, increased access to transnational media and consumer goods has led to a divide in Brazil's relatively small middle class. There's a traditional middle class whose members seemingly have conservative middle brow values, and then the other more conservative cosmopolitan middle class Brazilians who engage in countercultural practices informed by various kinds and degrees of leftist politics. By aligning to alternative music, AHALA and Enriquez position themselves against mainstream music and against the kinds of consumptive and political practices associated with it. They accordingly depict quote-unquote lame, parochial middle-class consumers as spectators who passively, as opposed to intellectually, engage with music that maintains generic boundaries. Seen through the eyes of alternative scene participants, middle-brow, middle-class consumers reinforce conservative social orders and uphold global northern hegemony. Traditional middle-class Brazilians often work as or aspire to be lawyers, engineers, or white-collar professionals who have historically mediated the export of natural commodities. Meanwhile, alternative scene insiders, many of whom are cultural workers, value their ability to produce and not just mediate or consume cultural commodities like music. Supposedly, they also pursue and restored knowledge of local music, that is rootedness, while cultivating socioaesthetic connections to distant, sophisticated places and people. Ahoda wasn't a primary entrepreneurial endeavor for any of its members. Their guitarist, Eduardo, however, shows some of the pros and cons of the formalization of entrepreneurial labor. In 2010, Eduardo was starting to work as a freelancer, composing jingles. He taught himself to use a synthesizer and software plugins to create virtual drum and orchestral sections. With the song palette, he produced songs for political candidates and commercials for businesses. Some songs, like the one he composed for a cell phone company, were pop-driven with conspicuous electronic sound effects. Yet for projects that sought to appeal to local consumers, he relied on genres like shochi, which are commonly heard as part of the Northeastern tradition. Unlike some of his middle-class peers, Eduardo didn't grow up playing regional music in carnival groups, but he was influenced by alternative bands and engagements with traditional music. He has translated this musically informed rootedness into a skill that enhances his work. His clientele was growing at the time, but he wanted to develop the mark of a business. By registering as an individual micro-entrepreneur or MEI, he recently established federal tax status for small-scale entrepreneurs. Eduardo wanted to become an MEI to professionalize his work, streamline the remuneration process, and gain more respect. His family and non-musician peers generally don't see musical careers as viable or respectable. His businessman father, for example, was skeptical of Eduardo's professional interest in music. Eduardo recounted that years before, one of his bands was invited to play at Recife largest rock festival. Instead of congratulating him, his father used this as an opportunity to scold him that he should study for the civil service test, not pursue music. MEI status exemplifies policies in Brazil and elsewhere that incentivize entrepreneurship and harness individuals as contributors to the enterprise of the state. Recife musicians and most Brazilians have long worked informally to cope with economic instability, but neoliberal forms of entrepreneurship have recently become more normative. During the recession of the 1990s, more middle-class people took on jobs in the informal economy. Maureen O'Doherty argues this shift helped popularize and legitimize neoliberal entrepreneurial practices. The federal government's development of MEI status builds on these legacies, but it's also representing a new era where entrepreneurialism shapes efforts to integrate more citizens into the formal economy. The MEI program was instituted in 2006. By 2015, 5 million Brazilians had registered, and by 2019, the total number of registrants grew to over 9 million. MEI status legalizes and formalizes labor undertaken by independent workers, including street vendors, manicurists, and hairdressers. But as of 2018, 70% of MEIs in Brazil work in music. In general, MEI status enables entrepreneurs to formally hire one employee and sell their products and services to clients without relying on a third party to issue a bill of sale. Also requires spending more money. It also requires them to contribute to Social Security and workers' compensation insurance, which is notable since musicians and other informal workers rarely do so. In 2011, Eduardo saw MEI status as a mechanism for self-regulation. He thought it was a good idea to quote-unquote regulate or regularizar one's work. Regularizar encompasses government oversight, which entails a more bureaucratic relationship to the state and making one's work more consistent. His reflexive thinking echoes scholarly arguments that entrepreneurial discourses push individuals to manage themselves. Such discourses push musicians to constantly improve themselves, such that the exploitative practices appear voluntary rather than externally imposed. People like Eduardo pursue their passion, but when this passion is channeled through neoliberal ideologies about work, as Marisol Sandoval describes, this quote transfers the battleground from the society onto the self and favors self-management over politics. Although MEI enrollment is widely accessible to musicians, it's seemingly not improving the gender imbalance of the CP's alternative scene. Most of the musicians I discuss in my book are men, which reflects Brazil's gender stratification in general. But it also suggests that NBCP gender-neutral policies like the MEI might be maintaining or sidestepping these disparities. In recent years, the alternative scene has included prominent female performers like Alessandro Leal and Isaac. Nonetheless, most bands are male-dominated. Women in bands typically perform as lead or backup singers, and those who play ostensibly masculine instruments like bass or drums, or form bands exclusively comprised of women are rare and often seen as novelties. Programs that incentivize entrepreneurship like MEI might provide a patina of professionalism. However, MEI status and the gig economy in general don't protect musicians from economic downturns, competition, or austerity policies. In 2012, Eduardo was performing jingles for political campaigns. This helped convince his father that his work was indeed legitimate. Following year, though, was harder. It wasn't an election year, and an economic downturn had pushed businesses to reduce their publicity costs. Enrolling as an MEI helped Eduardo amass some savings and build his reputation, but it wasn't an end in itself. Ultimately, his socio-professional networks were more valuable than MEI status because they helped him join forces with others to develop a production company. Since his company was registered as an LTD, he no longer needed his MEI status. In exchange for the independence that being a freelancer entails, forming the production company offered him more stability and chances for growth. His case shows that although formalization provides some benefits, sociocultural capital remains crucial to achieving professional success and weathering economic instability. This case also suggests that creating an entrepreneurial self can mean giving up a collective form of artistic satisfaction. In 2018, he and his former Ahalda bandmates reunited for a jam session. After a couple of hours, his friends were tired and ready to leave, but he was still energized and quote unquote hungry to keep going. Establishing the mark of a business that was not as artistically fulfilling as playing in a group. In outlining Eduardo and Ahalda's musical practices and discourses, we see how they develop a rooted cosmopolitan sense that reinforces their prestige and professional opportunities. In contrast, Maracatuna's Song from Vida Estrella shows how traditional working class musicians face different and more harrowing obstacles. Founded in 1935, Maracatuna's Song from Vida Estrella is one of the oldest maracatu groups or nações in Recife. It focuses on maracatu, a musical carnivalesque practice that Afro-descended people in Pernambuco have recreated and transformed for over 100 years. Next, I'll show you a clip of them performing during Carnival in 2011. It's terrible sound quality because it's just from this little camera I have, but I want you to feel how loud it is and how noisy it is. It actually kind of works to show you what it's like to be there. Without it. Just a small snippet, but when you're right behind them, the drums are just like in your all of your cells. It's crazy. Oh, there it goes. Vida Estrella's seniority affords them a place in the multicultural particle. However, due to a lack of consistent support from cultural agencies, the group feels abandoned by the state. Also, most of Vida Estrella's members or Cabindenses live in neighborhoods with high rates of violence and infrastructural deficits. However, performing in Carnival gives them a chance to challenge their stigmatization and their deprivation. As Hobson, a veteran member, explained, Carnival provides a way for us, quote, to have a space, to be with a microphone in a public place, a place with authority. In 2011, on the Saturday after Ash Wednesday, I attended the Champions Parade for the winners of the contest of Carnivalesque groups. Although the crowds were sparse, most reacted enthusiastically to Nações from the special group, the highest competitive tier. These groups had coordinated high-energy drumming and singing, which was made more spectacular by members of the royal court who danced in sparkling costumes. In keeping with the celebratory tone, these groups didn't mention racism or poverty during their performances, even though most of them are headquartered in racialized, marginalized communities. Instead, their songs included catchy lyrics and alluded to Xangô, the Afro-Brazilian religious practice. The range of themes in these songs reflects that Nações consist of interlocking processes that involve dance, religious rituals, and material culture. I liked seeing these groups, but I was there to see Caminho Estrela, who I had been following since January. They were going to accept a first place award in Group 1, the tier just below the special group. After waiting 6 hours at midnight, I finally saw Caminho Estrela parade. Approximately 100 performers, ranging in age from small children to senior citizens, marched and danced down the street. As they approached, I heard Evaldo, their main spokesperson at the time, announce that tonight the Black community will be surrounded by applause, but tomorrow we will return to the favelas without healthcare, without education. He then described Entropology de Africa as the anthem of the African National Congress, describing it as a quote, song of the struggle of the Black community, the struggle against apartheid throughout the world. Let's join the international struggle of the Black community. Caminho Estrela's performance of the anthem highlighted their ideological commitment to Pan-Africanism and anti-racism. They sang the anthem slowly in unison and in its original language, Xhosa. The only instrumental accompaniment included drummers marking the 4/4 beat by hitting their feet against each other. During this long introduction, Evaldo put the microphone up to individual group members, including young children. This threw off the rhythm, but emphasized the heterogeneous voices coming together. Then the group brought the anthem closer into alignment with traditional maracatu. The massive wooden alfaya drums kicked in, awkwardly shifting from the anthem's meter to the staggered 2/4 rhythm that powers maracatu's baki bilado, or turned around beat. The group's interpolation of this foreign anti-racist anthem clashed with the event's traditional festive tone, and the crowd's response was lackluster. Perhaps most were only there to cheer for special group nações. These groups received significant attention from government agencies, scholars, and the press. Most of my friends could name at least one special group maracatu, but they had never heard of Caminho Estrela. If we see them through Caminho's eyes, special group nações qualify as what political scientist Michael Hanchard would call culturalist. Culturalist groups reinforce hegemonic Brazilian ideologies that only accept Blackness when it's performed as a cultural and artistic expression rather than wielded as a political stance. The conditional acceptance of Blackness and ethno-racial differences within multicultural regimes means that to be recognized as legitimate by the state, minoritized groups must perform markedness and tradition in ways that are quote-unquote non-conflictual, as Elizabeth Povinelli and Dewey and Hooker describe. Caminho Estrela's performances and political stances chafe against this legibility. Caminho is trying to grasp the multicultural carnival's unifying ethos. Around the world, carnivals long been an opportunity for marginalized people to expose social injustice, in part because it's supposed to be a time when traditional power structures are inverted or temporarily suspended. Caminho readapted this opportunity in the neoliberal era. Traditional practices like maracatu are now a resource that institutions use to strengthen Pernambuco's economy in conformity with globalized market logics. However, through their performances, they draw attention to how these processes are negatively affecting working class racialized people. Caminhenses are thus rooted to Recife and integrated within an imagined community that includes the Global South and the Black Atlantic diaspora. They voice this project in a minor cosmopolitan key that challenges the stratification between North and South, metropole and periphery. They align to the Global South as a center of power that orients the political, ethical, and aesthetic dialogues in which they engage. Caminho Estrela is an outlier within Recife's field of maracatu. Since the 2000s, government organizations have used sponsorship to commodify traditional practices like maracatu as a tourist attraction and as an index of multiculturalism. Meanwhile, sponsorship pushes maracatu practitioners to construe themselves as entrepreneurs whose economic activities ostensibly empower them. However, even the most successful Muslims cope with financial instability and discrimination. Therefore, like samba schools in Rio, some nações sell spots to local and international tourists who want to experience a traditional maracatu carnival parade. These strategies connect to the globalization of maracatu. Since the 2000s, maracatu groups have been forming throughout Brazil and abroad, including in the US and Canada. The commercialization of maracatu has shifted institutional and vernacular aesthetic standards related to its authenticity. Special group nações are generally seen as the most authentic, but they also have the most resources to appeal to middle-class audiences that expect spectacular productions. A Camila Estrela stood out to middle-class spectators like my friend Thiago, who was only familiar with special group nações. Upon attending Camila's rehearsal, he realized, quote, I was used to middle-class maracatu's. That one is país, roots, in the community. The difference is brutal, end quote. For him, Camila Estrela's sound and style is roots because it's less theatrical and more Western. Some events seek an alternative path to the commercialization of maracatu, which they see as a process that reinforces structural inequality. Jessica explained, quote, we don't want to be global, nor do we create celebrations just for tourists. For her, the notion of tradition normalizes the unethical practices in which other nações engage to integrate maracatu into the global market. With a slight bite in her voice, she elaborated, quote, we don't participate in the legitimating discourse of tradition, we make tradition, end quote. Some events musically expand maracatu through incorporating non-traditional elements like the African anthem. But Jessica's claim is also about how some events make political critique part of maracatu. Similarly, Ferguson defended Camille's reputation as a quote-unquote boring maracatu, arguing, quote, some people want to cover up the city's rules, but we expose them, end quote. Maintaining this project, though, is very difficult. Performing in carnival is one of the only sources of funding. Camila Estrela exposes the city's rooms, but the Champions Parade performance demonstrates that this project isn't parochial. They be situated as part of the African diaspora and the global South, and in so doing, they contest the conditions that reduce maracatu into a static commodity. Camila Estrela benefits from government sponsorship, but they use their platform to critique multicultural policies and discourses. They refract multiculturalism, bending it back toward the politicians, institutions, and individuals who they see as complicit in reducing maracatu to a spectacle that reinforces the hierarchical status quo. The group thus shows how marginalized people create a kind of cosmopolitanism that belies its reputation as an elitist practice. Some events also reveal that the incentivization of entrepreneurialism ignores and penalizes those who cannot or don't want to embrace the role of citizens as enterprise. Seen in this light, Camila Estrela illustrates that even under the aegis of multiculturalism, carnival and state sponsorship reinforce the hegemony of neoliberalism, along with the overlapping structural inequalities that helps perpetuate. During the 2000s, the fact that so many musicians had to work so hard to just get by, despite the availability of sponsorship, seemed like an aberration or a glitch. Over time, however, I realized these conditions are integral to sponsorship. Since multicultural policies were structured by neoliberal principles, they were addressing market logics, not egalitarian or regressive principles. Sponsorship wasn't built to be fully inclusive. Instead, it's a resource to transform people into entrepreneurs who theoretically strengthen the economy. Despite the downsides of multicultural sponsorship, its end in the 2010s due to economic decline and political shifts made life even more precarious for Recife musicians. Multicultural sponsorship had provided them some infrastructure, even as it incentivized entrepreneurship. Informally since 2013 and more definitively since 2017, however, sponsorship policies have shifted focus to more explicitly promoting entrepreneurship. New policies tend to provide smaller incentives, placing more responsibilities on individuals and focusing less on musical diversity. My interlocutors have noticed, for example, that Recife Carnival is no longer as diverse. Stages once reserved for alternative music now feature more commercially popular mainstream acts. Consequently, some alternative musicians are forming artistic collectives while scaling down performances to suit smaller spaces. Sonically, the rootedness to the local is more diffuse than a hobbyist approach, but the creation of denser and broader collaborations is rooting them to the city, fostering nested senses of socio-professional belonging. So my book focused on a short period in Brazil's recent history that included dramatic changes across socioeconomic domains. One constant, however, was my interlocutor's commitment to music as a central part of their lives. Music both reflects and shapes their interactions with the state and with each other. It's also inherently linked to interlocking structures of power that varyingly enable and limit their ability to survive in the global economy. So many thanks for your attention, and to Lacies for both organizing this, but also because they helped with the subvention for my book publication. So I'm very grateful for that. and everyone present in this room that helped it come to fruition directly and indirectly. Thank you so much. Now let's take a question.
Thank you for the presentation, that was very interesting. My question is, what was the criteria, if you're aware of it, for deciding whether something is a culture or not? You said you eliminated Bahian biology or something like that. Why? What was the justification?
There's many justifications. So I actually sat in on the sponsorship committee to see why they define culture in certain ways. That was mostly my dissertation. And part of the reason that they didn't include Bahia and Pagode was because it's Bahia, right? It's like, well, we're not Bahia. We want our carnival to be carnival.
Okay.
But then you might ask, well, but then why do you include samba and like what, like from Rio de Janeiro? Because there is like a local samba scene. So why do you include samba from Rio de Janeiro, or why do you include pop music from people from Sao Paulo? Well, that's because it's more prestigious, right? It's more seen as more worldly, as more globally plugged in. And then, of course, the Southeast is this kind of hegemonic cultural center of Brazil. Meanwhile, Bahia is not. And the Bahian music that they exclude is highly racialized and sexualized as well. So it's seen as something that's very déclassé and is not culturally representative. But then again, you could argue that those other genres are not culturally representative either. But what they do in accepting, for example, Bahia and Pagode, they would be at risk of reinforcing the kind of broader racialization and stigmatization of the Northeast as like the racial other of Brazil, right? Essentially, they don't want to seem that, they don't want it to seem like who is like too black, essentially. But they say this often very implicitly through their classist discourses, which are also very much part of it, right? They don't also want to be seen as lower class or working class, right? But it's always wrapped up in these racializing ideologies too.
So did they include Bumbo Boy or not?
No, Google Boy is not really practiced in Recife, and it wouldn't be included either because it's not from Pernambuco really. So what happens is there are so on the Wednesday, I believe there's like a Google Boy type thing that happens in Oliva, but that's financed by the municipal government, if at all. I'm not sure. It's not part of the like state presentation of Parliament.
Yeah, thank you.
Sure. Okay, you had a question?
Yeah, I'm asking. I my sense is that since that maybe pretty rarely that there's a rising voice of people who be concerned. Black communities will be exactly the argument that there are the voices of the Black communities. Yeah, and I'm just wondering, I understand that so that the community emphasizes my wrong, and that the individuals. Yes. But I'm wondering if it isn't also that the shift might not also be this changing discourse of race, which is coming from not just rising activism from the early 2000s, particularly, but also a response to those racism. Which I think has really changed the discussion within the workers' party and going forward.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. So part of the issue is that my research doesn't deal with the Bolsonaro era very much. When I last went to do field work, it was the election year, but he hadn't been elected yet or anything. In fact, it was February and March. So I know it was still very much kind of, a possibility, but not a foregone conclusion. But I think Camila still is an interesting example because they were kind of on the cutting edge of a lot of discourses that suddenly became more popular. And I agree, I think they became more popular as a response to Bolsonarismo, right? But also there were, there's people too in the middle class, like people that I work with who are very attentive and aware of racism within the music scene and just more generally. So there were people that I worked with that were, for example, promoters, that many of their clientele were kind of middle class contemporary musicians, but they also had traditional working class clientele who they knew needed extra help and different kinds of help, especially since many traditional musicians at the time were elderly people with limited digital literacy who couldn't access this sponsorship even if they wanted to without help from a lot of people. So some of them are very cognizant of that. There was also some incidences where traditional performances were shut down early by the police because of noise ordinances. But then with some activism on the part of middle class and working class musicians, they fought this, these ordinances essentially, and it went up to the high court in the state. And it was, they ended up saying that, no, it's, we shouldn't be prohibiting this. This is a violation of their rights, especially because there's so much precedent for those performances having taken place for a really, really long time, right? But in short, yes, I think there's been more of a kind of embrace of Blackness. But Pernambuco is an interesting paradox because on the one hand, it's known as a kind of leftist place, especially during the dictatorship. It was one of the more leftist states. But then you also have people who are in positions of power that get to decide who gets to be part of it, for example, that would see themselves, they're PT people, or they see themselves as leftists, but are also kind of culturally conservative in a sense, because there's this trap in a sense of like, well, but we don't want to be seen by outsiders as this, and that connects to that earlier question, right? So there's all of these interesting tensions around race anyway that I can't give like a very nice pat answer about, but I hope that helps address some of your issues here.
For questions in the room, if you can speak loudly or if you can paraphrase the question.
Oh, sure,
for
sorry.
people,
Yes.
but anybody else? Yeah.
Sure.
Thanks, Falina. It's nice to talk about our research rather than about the anthropology.
Yeah.
I have a question about, I was struck by the comments of one of the musicians from Canada about the consuming and listening to the music and the contrast with passive listening versus, usually intellectual listening. When I was wondering, going off of that, in this idea of music cosmopolitanism, that there's also an effort to police the behavior of audiences with certain kinds of listening, sitting down or certain data points that are seen as more acceptable than others. So, what if we focused on how people listen to this music rather than the people, right? What would you say?
Yeah, that's a great question. The question is about the distinction between passive consumption and intellectual consumption and what that looks like on the listening end, right? Well, I mean, for a Homer, like, it's also sort of a paradox in the sense that they want to play shows that are well attended and where people are dancing and having fun. But then they also want to play shows where you're in a small venue and people can really see and absorb what's going on. And so, I mean, I think in an ideal world where they still together, they would play a mix of those both kinds of performances, right? And for the listening, that goes also into kind of broader Brazilian ideologies about music, right? That participation is meant to be embodied, right? Most of the ways that you identify a rhythm is also, well, what dance moves are associated with it, and vice versa, right? If you're doing a certain dance move, well, it's a play every dance move. And that's how you can sometimes play it to what kinds of things you're trying to signal by incorporating dance moves or costumes or things associated with other genres, even if it's musically not there entirely. But in doing that, it's this effort to kind of, on the one hand, show like we are from here and we're unique, but we also want to appeal to broader audiences. That's a sort of appeal to universality they're trying to do. They're trying to strike a balance, which I don't know that's entirely possible, right? Between like having a dedicated global audience that it listens to them in an active way because they understand kind of where they're coming from, like why this music is the way it is. But they also want to keep it open for broader audiences that maybe just hear it as something fun to dance to or something relatively exotic, right? With the hopes that that is then an entryway into the more activism. I think it's also because as musicians, they listen differently to music. They consume it differently than people who are not musicians. And I think they wish that more audience members could be as engaged as they are, even as consumers and not producers. But ultimately, too, if you look at it sort of cynically, it's also kind of like a branding strategy. It's like we want to make sure we seem different and cooler than other bands that are just party bands. And that stuff all connects to my response to the earlier question as well, like avoiding seeming too sexy, too racialized, having lyrics that are too silly or repetitive, and those tie up to kind of Brazilian ideologies that are informed by Western ideologies about what makes good music, right? It's a very kind of like angle, not of things.
Can I ask you a follow-up question?
Sure.
How does that extend to carnival and what people are expected to do as they listen to the different carnival groups, and especially the I forgot what they're called, the top tier groups versus from the Estrella and their performance, and how the audience behaving differently for the different types of groups, and are some audience on participation found out and others are encouraged?
Yeah, so the question is about how people participate in carnival related to different genres. Carnival, again, is supposed to be the special time, right? Where in theory, everyone should be dancing to everything and be drunk and be having fun, right? And so I guess to not participate adequately would be able to be sitting down with a careta, as they say, with like a sour face and not, and actually there's songs about that, like Caetano Veloso, who talks about that as well. And like the smoothie people are the ones in the salon and the dance hall, they're not out in the street participating with everyone. So there are definite expectations about what it means to properly participate in carnival, and for the most part, it should all be fully participative and not contemplative, intellectual kinds of listening. However, like Ahoda played at carnival, not on the main stage, and they were very much into like trying to hype up the audience and getting people to dance and stuff. So it's not that their kind of music forecloses that kind of participation, especially with carnival. Again, carnival is like the more participation, the better. Right? Any other questions? What if maybe from the Zoom people?
No, there's no questions.
Go ahead.
So, when you use this concept, you need to kind of supplement the limits of this concept, or you use it in a one this cost under this.
Yes, the question was about essentially why I chose moving cosmopolitanism. I chose it for multiple reasons. One in that I kept hearing discourses that were very much gesturing toward that, right? That picture of the tree with the roots was at an exhibit at a music festival, and they had all kinds of pictures around and such that were about the sort of fenomenal culture being a tree, and we have a common trunk, and there are these other expressions. Right? There's all these sort of organic metaphors that were brought up in the course of my field research. But I was like, okay, rootedness keeps coming up. And then the word root raiz is also used to demarcate specific genres, like samba de raiz emerge as like samba, root samba versus more commercialized forms of samba. There's all kinds of these variations. So it's a commercial category. It's also a kind of ideological category, like speaking. But then, I'd be hearing from Ahoda, but also Camila Stella, where like the people in those groups listen to music from all over the world. Like people in Camila Stella were listening to West African music, or listening to Azorian music, or listening to James Brown, right? Like listening very widely. And so I'm like, well, yeah, on the one hand, they're very much about the here and now, right? But they're also about these other places and sounds and imaginaries that are really relevant to them. And then on top of that, I plugged into ideas of vernacular cosmopolitanism, which is a sort of theoretical niche that's been developing for the past 20 years or so. That's about like, yes, it's not just elites that are like jet setters that are cosmopolitan. It's also people who maybe never leave their house, but still have these cosmopolitan frameworks and trying to, feel a sense of belonging to people and places and ideas that are beyond their local, right? Beyond the local. It's about creating a kind of locality that's nested and multi-sided, even in the absence of actual travel, right? And there's also minor cosmopolitanism, which Jerome pointed out to me, which is another thread of this, of the efforts to make south to south connections, as opposed to the south to north connections and north to north.
It's a question here.
Oh, sure.
This says, can you elaborate?
On the
the
sentiment, wanted to make music for themselves rather than for, what does that say? Tourism. How is it different from musicians and tourism? Yeah, so it wasn't just coming this, the question is sort of about elaborating on the concept of we don't want to make people like this for tourists. That applies to Camila and Uphold. And there's again kind of funny paradoxes. So Camila was playing maracatu, which has become so touristified, right? But they were doing it in their own way that kind of butted against the touristic forms of maracatu. There's even another level of maracatu that's even more spectacular, right? That it's been adapted for stage production, because usually it's a processional kind of format. Maracatu Nacional Pernambuco is the most famous one in Olinda. It has become since the 90s a stage production. So there are kind of different degrees of commercialization, right? And even Camila it didn't constitute an opt-out. They still wanted to be part of Carnival, and they would debate it every year, apparently. They would put it up to a vote. We still want to perform in Carnival because we're still in debt from last year and the year before, and it's so expensive, and let's put it up for a vote. And mostly they would vote yes, because it was such an important part of their lives. And because again, you get a space to be in public, have a microphone that people hear you in a way that you can't otherwise. Now, in terms of the touristic music for like people in bands like Volta, they definitely want more tourists to come, but they also don't want to have to play in a way that they wouldn't want to play otherwise, right? Like they don't want to have to play genres that are super commercially popular and to play for tourists. There was also a big disappointment in 2014 with the World Cup that they thought they'd be able to play for a lot more people from all over the world, but most of the official productions were targeting these bands that are from other states, like from the other northern state, bands that have hundreds of millions of fans, practically definitely millions of fans, and that are also ostensibly, like the sort of rumor is that, but it's not much of a rumor, I think it's pretty factual, but the owner, at least one owner of one of these bands also has a position in the tourism board, right, in the state. So it's like, hire my bands, please, to play for Carnival. So that's kind of the terrain that's going on in terms of playing for tourists or not. But then overall, like Recife is not a huge tourist destination to the degree that Salvador is, Sao Paulo, Rio, other bigger cities. So it's also not a huge concern because there aren't that many tourists, especially outside of Carnival. Carnival's when the tourists come, and apart from that, there's very little like steady tourism on the level that other cities get.
All right. Well, with that, it's for me to thank Falina for the presentation, and thank you for the